He stood up in front of everyone and destroyed her with a single sentence, at his own anniversary gala, in front of 500 people who feared his name. Vittorio Moretti, the most powerful crime boss in New York, pointed at his wife of 7 years and told the room she was finished. He didn't whisper it. He didn't pull her aside. He picked up a microphone, smiled at the woman beside him, a woman who was not his wife, and said, "The future of this family stands right here." Elara Voss Moretti sat perfectly still at the head table. She didn't flinch, didn't reach for her glass, didn't look at Sabrina Vale, who was draped across Vit's arm like she'd always belonged there. She simply removed her wedding ring, set it on the white tablecloth, and said quietly enough that only those nearest her could hear, "You really should have read what you signed." Then she stood up and walked out. And that was the night Vittorio Moretti handed over everything he had ever built, and didn't know it yet. If you've ever been humiliated by someone who thought you had nothing left, stay with me. This story is for you. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. Part 1. The gala had been Sabrina's idea. That was the first thing Elara thought when she walked through the service entrance of the Carrington Hotel on the night of her own anniversary. Not through the grand lobby, not up the marble staircase where photographers clustered near the velvet rope. Through the back, past the linen carts and the kitchen noise, because she had arrived early, 2 hours before the guests, to check the seating arrangements herself. She had done it every year for 7 years. Not because Vit asked her to. He never asked her to do anything. He simply expected it to be done, and it always was. Because Elara was the kind of woman who understood that the difference between a powerful man and a stupid one was usually the person standing 3 feet behind him, making sure his empire didn't fall apart while he was busy looking impressive. The ballroom was already half lit when she walked through. Chandeliers burning low, white tablecloths smooth as paper, centerpieces of dark orchids and ivory candles, her choice, as always. She had called the florist herself that morning. She had approved the menu the week before, crossed out the third wine pairing because Vit's accountant had a sensitivity to sulfites and would spend the reception miserable if she didn't catch it. And she had quietly rerouted 3 of the table assignments when she realized 2 of Vit's lieutenants had been placed beside men they were currently in a silent dispute with. Nobody had noticed. Nobody was supposed to. She stood in the middle of the ballroom for a moment, just breathing. There was something she had learned early in her marriage, something she had never told anyone, not even her sister. She had always known this night would come, not the specific night, not the specific woman, but the shape of it. The general outline of a man like Vit deciding he had finally outgrown the scaffolding that had held him up. She had planned for it anyway. That was the difference between Elara Voss Moretti and every other woman who had ever made the mistake of loving a man like Vit. She had never confused love with surrender. She was 31 when she married him. Her family was not in the business, not directly. Her father had been a forensic accountant for most of his career, working briefly for the federal government before a private offer from an anonymous firm pulled him sideways into a world he'd never fully described to his children. He died when Elara was 24, leaving behind 3 things: a modest insurance policy, a filing cabinet full of documents she spent 3 years quietly studying, and an introduction, made posthumously through a letter she found in his desk, to a man named Corrado Moretti, Vit's father. Corrado was already sick by then. Prostate cancer, spreading slowly, making him honest in the way that only dying men and very drunk men ever really are. He had reached out to her father years earlier because he trusted the man's discretion. Now, with Elara sitting across from him in his study, he explained what he actually needed. The Moretti organization was bleeding, not from violence, from stupidity, specifically from Vit's older brother Marco, who had spent 2 years skimming from the organization's legitimate holding companies and hiding it behind a network of shell accounts that were now attracting the kind of federal scrutiny that couldn't be bribed or threatened away. Marco was gone by then. Corrado had handled that in his own way, but the damage remained. Elara spent 4 months studying the structure. Then she rebuilt it. She was 25 years old. She worked from a rented office above a dry cleaning shop in Midtown, with 2 laptops and a filing system that would have confused most forensic accountants she'd ever met.
She moved assets through a chain of legitimate holding companies. She established trusts in 3 jurisdictions.
She designed a succession architecture that was technically airtight, every transfer fully documented, every authorization trail carefully buried inside layers of compliance paperwork that looked, from the outside, exactly like a very conservative, wealthy family protecting its real estate interests. Corrado paid her generously. He also introduced her to his son. She should have walked away from Vit the first time she met him. She knew that now. He was 29, already running significant portions of the family business, and he had a quality that she had never been able to explain without sounding like a fool, a kind of absolute certainty in his own presence that she had mistaken, for a long time, for strength. It wasn't strength. It was the thing that grows in men who have never been told no by anyone who mattered. But she was 25 and her father had just died, and Vit looked at her like she was the most interesting person in any room he'd ever entered. She had not been prepared for how much that would mean to her. They married 2 years later. Corrado was there, thin and yellowish and quietly satisfied, watching his son take a woman he trusted to protect what he'd built. Elara understood, even at the wedding, that she was marrying 2 things simultaneously, Vit and the Empire. She had simply chosen to love one of them honestly. By the time the gala was 7 years in, she no longer needed to study the seating chart. She held it in her head the same way she held everything, the account numbers, the route schedules, the names of the contacts in 3 countries who would only speak to her directly because Vit had never bothered to learn their languages or their customs. She was reviewing the bar setup when Marta found her. Marta was 62, had worked for the Moretti household for 11 years, and possessed the specific quality of a woman who has spent decades around powerful people. She said very little and communicated volumes. She appeared at Elara's elbow and said, "There's a second dress on the rack in the executive suite." Elara set down the cocktail napkin she'd been examining. "Whose suite?" "Mr. Moretti booked it this morning. The dress is not yours." Elara was quiet for a moment. "What color?" "Red." She nodded slowly. "Thank you, Marta." Marta didn't move. "There's also a florist arrangement that arrived separately, different from yours. Cards addressed to the suite." "I understand." "The name on the delivery invoice, Marta." Elara's voice was quiet and final. "I know." She did know. She had known the name for 4 months. She had known the hotel suite for 6 weeks. Had known, in fact, that Vit had been using the Carrington's executive floor as a meeting point since early spring, because the hotel's general manager was a man named Franklin Chu, who had a small but uncomfortable connection to a freight arrangement Elara had personally managed 3 years earlier, and Franklin Chu had made a private phone call to her in February, because he believed correctly that she was the person who actually managed the Moretti family's interests, and he wanted to be sure there were no misunderstandings about his loyalty. There were no misunderstandings. She thanked him, told him she would not need anything specific, and asked him only to let her know if the suite was used for any event connected to the anniversary gala. He had called her that morning. She had thanked him again and hung up and stood in her kitchen for a long moment, her coffee getting cold on the counter, looking at the view of the city that she had spent 7 years turning into something safe. Then she had gotten dressed and come to check the seating chart. The guests arrived at 7. Elara stood at Vit's side for the first hour, exactly as she always had, greeting, remembering names, tracking the small social politics that moved through a room like this, the way weather moves through a valley. She knew who was aligned with whom. She knew whose business had softened in the past quarter and whose had gotten suddenly, suspiciously, stronger. She knew which of Vit's lieutenants were nervous and which ones were performing a calm they didn't feel. 3 of them, Carmine, Rio, and a younger man named Stellan, who had been with the organization for 4 years, had positioned themselves in different corners of the room. Not obviously. But Elara had been watching rooms like this for 7 years, and she noticed the way they avoided meeting Vit's eyes. She also noticed that they did not avoid meeting hers. Carmine, catching her gaze across the room at approximately 8:15, gave her a nod that was small enough to be nothing and deliberate enough to be everything. She moved on. At 8:40, Vit leaned close and said, "I need to make a short announcement." His breath was steady, his jaw was set. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed something and was determined not to let his nerves show. "Of course," she said. He signaled to the band leader. The music softened. The room began to quiet in that particular way of crowds sensing something is about to happen. Not alarmed yet, just tilting toward attention. Vit picked up the microphone near the bar. 7 years ago, he said, I made a decision that shaped everything about the life I've built. The room smiled. Anniversary toasts were expected at events like this. They were a tradition. I've been thinking about legacy, Vit continued, about what it means to look forward instead of backward, about choosing the future over the past. Elara stood very still. This family moves forward tonight. He paused. And it moves forward with someone who represents everything I believe in. He turned. Sabrina Vale stepped out of the crowd near the bar. Red dress, dark hair, composed in the specific way of a woman who has been practicing this moment for weeks. She was beautiful. She was also, Elara now knew with certainty, very deliberately positioned in a room full of people who would remember every detail of this night for the rest of their lives. Vit extended his hand. Sabrina took it. The room went absolutely silent. Not the polite silence of a crowd waiting for a punchline. The stunned, held-breath silence of 500 people watching something irreversible happen in real time. Elara looked at Vit's face. He was watching her. Not Sabrina, not the crowd. Watching Elara. Waiting for something. Tears, maybe. An objection. Some visible crack in the composure she had maintained for 7 years. She gave him nothing. She reached up slowly and removed the wedding ring from her left hand. A simple band with a single diamond. She had chosen it herself, because Vit had handed her a catalog and told her to pick whatever she wanted, and she had understood even then that the gesture meant he wanted to be generous without paying attention. She had picked the simplest one. She set it on the white tablecloth, looked at Vit, said it quietly. You really should have read what you signed. Then she picked up her small evening bag, pushed her chair back and walked through the ballroom toward the main exit, and she did not hurry, and she did not look back, and the sound of her heels on the marble floor was the loudest thing in the room. Or what Vit did not see, because he was watching Elara leave and already composing his private satisfaction at having finally done it, was what happened in her wake. Carmine Asante, who had been with the Moretti organization for 19 years and had personally killed 2 men at Corrado's request and 3 more at Vit's, put down his glass of whiskey and walked toward the exit. Rio Santini, younger, sharper, a man Vit had promoted twice in 3 years because he believed Rio's loyalty was unbreakable, followed 30 seconds later. Stellan Park, who ran the organization's freight management on the East Coast and knew every warehouse, every route, and every off-book arrangement between Maine and Virginia, slipped out through the service corridor. None of them looked at Vit. All 3 of them were in the parking garage when Elara's car pulled around. She got in. The car moved. They followed. Vit's phone rang at 9:17. He was still in the ballroom, surrounded by the kind of noise that happens when a crowd tries to process shock by converting it into conversation. Sabrina was beside him, her hand on his arm. She was smiling in a way that hadn't quite settled on her face yet, like a painting that was still drying. He almost didn't answer. Then he saw the name. Gregor Hahn, his private banker. The man who managed the 7 accounts Vit used exclusively for organizational cash flow. The accounts that existed behind 3 layers of corporate structure that, as far as Vit had ever understood, were fully his. He stepped away from Sabrina, pressed the phone to his ear. Gregor? Mr. Moretti. A pause. The kind of pause that comes before something that has been practiced and is still difficult. I'm calling because we've received an authorization request that overrides the primary account access. Vit felt the first cold thing move through him. What authorization request? All 7 accounts under the Moretti Holdings umbrella have been flagged for a security review. Pending the completion of that review, withdrawal access requires secondary authorization from... Another pause. Gregor was a man of significant personal courage who was clearly finding this moment difficult. From Mrs. Moretti. Vit stopped walking. Elara. Yes, sir. That's not possible. I understand this is unexpected, Mr. Moretti, but the authorization structure has been in place since the accounts were established. I want to be clear that my office did not design this arrangement. I designed those accounts, Vit said. His voice was flat and very controlled. I built that structure years ago. Yes, sir, but the secondary authorization protocol was built into the foundational documents. It appears to have been part of the original corporate trust design. Vit said nothing. 7 accounts, 7 years old. He had signed documents he hadn't read in detail because the detail had always been Elara's department, and he had trusted the outcome because the outcome had always been exactly what he needed it to be. And it had never occurred to him in 7 years to ask whose name was actually attached to the mechanism that made everything run. "How long has this protocol been there?" he said. Gregor's answer was quiet. "Since the beginning, sir." Vit ended the call. He stood very still in the edge of the ballroom, the noise of 500 people continuing to move around him, and he looked at the table where Elara had been sitting. The ring was still there, a small diamond catching the light from the chandelier above, sitting on a white tablecloth like an answer to a question he had just realized he'd never thought to ask. Sabrina appeared at his elbow. "What's wrong?" He looked at her. For the first time since the announcement, something moved through Vit Moretti's face that was not confidence, not satisfaction, not the quiet pleasure of a man who has finally done what he wanted to do. It was the specific, dawning expression of someone who has just taken a very confident step forward and felt the floor disappear beneath their foot. "Nothing," he said. He tucked the phone into his jacket, and he started to understand that the night was not over. The ring was still on the table when Vit walked back to it. He stood over it for a moment, just stood there, with the noise of the ballroom still churning behind him, and Sabrina somewhere near the bar trying to read his face from across the room. He looked at the ring the way a man looks at something he thought he understood, and is only now realizing he never did. Then he picked it up, closed his fist around it, and walked toward the exit without telling anyone where he was going. His driver, Paolo, was waiting outside on the street. Professional habit. Paolo always positioned the car close enough to the entrance that Vit never had to wait, never had to stand on a sidewalk exposed, never had to look like a man who needed to be anywhere other than exactly where he chose to be. Tonight, Paolo took one look at Vit's face and said nothing, just opened the rear door. Vit got in. "Where to, sir?" "Drive." Paolo drove. They moved through Midtown in silence, the city doing what it always did, indifferent, loud, continuous. Vit sat with Elara's ring in his closed fist and stared out the window and tried to locate the exact moment he had misread something. He was not a man who did this often. He was not built for it. Vit Moretti operated by momentum, forward, always forward, and if something broke behind him, he trusted the people around him to clean it up. He had never had to backtrack, had never had to stand in the wreckage of a decision and ask himself where it had started. He was asking now. His phone lit up again. Not Gregor this time. Franco Luca, his operations manager, the man who coordinated the daily movement of product, people, and cash across the tri-state area with the kind of quiet efficiency that Vit had always taken for granted. He answered, "Franco, we've got a problem with the Bayshore route." Franco's voice was tight, not panicked. Franco didn't panic, but tight in the way of a man who is holding something in. "The access codes to the storage facility changed. Night crew can't get in. I'm getting no answer from the logistics contact." Vit felt the cold thing again. "Which logistics contact?" "Paulson. He's our man at the Bayshore terminal. I've tried 3 times. Nothing." Paulson was not a man who went silent. Paulson was the kind of man who answered calls at 2 in the morning because that was what he was paid to do. "Send 2 men to the terminal," Vit said. "Physical access." "Already tried. The security company that manages the building says the contract holder's authorization is required for after-hours entry." A pause. "The contract holder's name on file isn't yours, sir." Vit already knew what name was on file. He ended the call before Franco finished the sentence. He called Elara's cell phone at 9:45. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Her voice on the recording was calm and neutral. She had recorded it 3 years ago and never changed it, which Vit had always interpreted as efficiency, and was only now considering might have been something else entirely. He didn't leave a message. He called again at 9:52, same result. At 10:04, he called a man named Dex Rourke, who ran the private investigative arm of the Moretti organization. Not a glamorous role, more like a utility function, the kind of person you needed when you needed to know where someone was and preferred they didn't know you were asking. Dex was good, discreet. Vit had used him a dozen times over the years to track people who'd made poor decisions about their relationship to the Moretti family.
He had never used him to track his own wife. "Elara," he said when Dex picked up.
"I need a location." Dex was quiet for half a second, long enough that Vit noticed it. "On it," Dex said. And then, "I'll call you back." He didn't call back. Vit waited 30 minutes, then an hour. He had Paolo park outside a coffee shop on Lexington that had been closed for 2 hours, the interior dark. And he sat in the back of the car watching the street and calling Dex every 15 minutes and reaching voicemail every time. Dex Rourke, who had answered his phone within 2 rings for 9 years, had gone dark. By midnight, Vit was back at the penthouse. Sabrina was already there. She'd had a key for 4 months, and another thing Vit had done without examining closely, the simple transactional logic of a man who had decided he wanted someone and proceeded to rearrange his life around that want without consulting anyone who might have slowed him down. She was on the sofa, still in the red dress, shoes off, watching him with the careful expression of a woman who has learned to read men's moods as a survival skill. "Talk to me," she said. "Not now." "Vit, I said not now, Sabrina." He moved to the bar, poured 2 fingers of bourbon, didn't drink it, just stood there with the glass in his hand, his back to her. "The storage facility at Bayshore can't be accessed. My banker called tonight because Elara's name is attached to a secondary authorization protocol on every major account I own. Dex Rourke, a man I have paid for 9 years, has not returned a single call in the last hour and a half." He set the glass down. "So I'm going to need you to give me a few minutes to think." She was quiet. He turned and looked at her. And for the first time since he'd stood up at the gala with a microphone in his hand, he looked at her the way he hadn't let himself look at anything all night. Not with desire or satisfaction or the forward momentum of a man executing a decision, but with the flat, evaluating gaze of someone who runs a criminal organization and has survived this long by knowing when something in his environment has shifted. "How long have you known Dorian Kessler?" he said. Something moved across her face. Gone in a half second, professionally controlled, but there. "What?" "Dorian, my consigliere. How long have you two known each other?" "I met him at the charity event in March. You introduced us." "I introduced you?" He nodded slowly. "That's right. I did." He picked up the bourbon and drank half of it. "Funny thing, I mentioned the gala to Dorian in January, the plan. He was the first person I told." Sabrina said nothing. "You and I didn't meet until February." "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything." He set the glass down again, cleanly, without anger. "I'm just noticing a sequence." She stood up. Her composure was excellent. He had always appreciated that about her, the steadiness, the way she held herself in difficult moments. He was only now asking himself what kind of life requires a person to develop that quality so thoroughly. "I think you're under stress and you're looking for something to point at," she said. "I'm not your enemy, Vit. I'm the person who's been beside you through this whole thing." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he moved toward the bedroom. "Get some sleep," he said. "We'll talk in the morning." He closed the door behind him and did not sleep. At 6:15 the next morning, he drove to Dorian Kessler's brownstone in the West 50s. Dorian answered the door in a robe, coffee in hand, reading glasses pushed up on his head, the practiced image of a man caught at ease, domestically unguarded. He was 61, gray-haired, with a face that had the kind of settled authority that comes from decades of being the smartest person in the room and knowing it. He had been Vittorio Moretti's consigliere first, then Vit's, and there was almost nothing about the organization's structure, financial, operational, strategic, that he did not know intimately. "Vit." He stepped back to let him in. "I heard about the gala. Ugly business." "Is it?" Dorian led him through to the kitchen, poured a second cup of coffee without asking. "Elara's a complicated woman. I always said that." "You always said that," Vit agreed. He sat at the kitchen table. "Walk me through the account structure, the Moretti Holdings umbrella, original setup." Dorian sat across from him, set his coffee down. "That's an old file. Most of that architecture was built before you and I were working closely." "I know, Elara built it. Tell me what you know about the secondary authorization protocol." A pause. Short, but the same length as the pause Dex had given him last night. "I wasn't deeply involved in that design. That was largely between Elara and the banking relationship. Gregor Hahn told me last night that the protocol has been there since the beginning, since the accounts were established. Then Elara built it in from the start. Did you know about it? Dorian picked up his coffee, drank. I may have been aware of a dual authorization structure. At the time, it seemed like a reasonable security measure. Your father approved it.
Vit went very still.
My father approved it.
He trusted Elara's judgment on the financial architecture. You know that. I know my father trusted Elara.
Vit leaned forward slightly.
I'm asking whether you knew specifically that Elara's authorization could lock me out of my own accounts, and whether that information was something you chose to mention to me at any point in the last 7 years.
Dorian looked at him steadily.
I didn't believe it would ever become relevant. That's not what I asked. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Dorian set his coffee cup down with the small, precise movement of a man who is making sure his hands are steady.
You're in a difficult position this morning, Dorian said. That's understandable, but I'd be careful about who you point the blame at. Elara built a complicated system. It served the family for years. If there are elements of it that you didn't fully understand, that's a conversation you should have had with her a long time ago. Vit stood up. Thank you for the coffee, he said. He walked back through the brownstone and out the front door, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the early morning cold, people moving past him on the way to their ordinary lives, and he thought about the specific texture of what Dorian had just done. Not what he'd said, but how he'd said it. The measured reasonableness, the careful deflection, the way he'd pivoted from the question of his own knowledge to a commentary on Vit's failures. Vit had been listening to men talk for a very long time. He knew the difference between a man who was uncomfortable and a man who was managing him. Dorian Kessler had been managing him. Franco Luca met him at a diner in Queens at 8 in the morning with a folder of papers and the look of a man who hadn't slept. It's not just Bayshore, Franco said, keeping his voice low. He slid the folder across the table. Greenpoint Warehouse, same issue. New access codes. Our people can't get in. The freight arrangement through Newark. The contact there says his standing instruction from the logistics manager has changed, and he needs written authorization before he releases anything. Written authorization from someone on the primary trust document. Vit opened the folder. Names, account numbers, facility addresses. 7 locations. All flagged or locked or suddenly requiring authorization he couldn't provide. This didn't happen overnight, Vit said. No, sir. Franco folded his hands on the table. He was a careful man, Franco, the kind who delivered information exactly and then waited, because he understood that his job ended at the delivery and what happened next was not his call. This looks like it was set up over a period of time, months, maybe longer. How many people knew the structure well enough to do this? Elara, and whoever she worked with. Franco hesitated. And anyone who had access to the original incorporation documents. Vit looked at him. Who has access to those documents? They're held in a secure file through the legal firm, Partridge and Associates. Vit had worked with Partridge for 11 years. Get me on the phone with Marcus Partridge. Franco slid his own phone across the table, already dialing. Marcus Partridge answered on the second ring. I was a man of 64 who had navigated the legal edge of the Moretti organization's affairs with the dexterous calm of someone who had long ago made his peace with the nature of his clients. He was not a man who showed distress easily. He sounded distressed. Vit, he said, I've been trying to reach you since last night. I'm here now. I received notification yesterday evening, before the gala ended, in fact, that a review of the primary trust documents had been formally initiated. A pause. Under the terms of the original agreement, this review triggers an automatic administrative freeze on certain asset classes pending verification of the succession clause.
The succession clause, Vit repeated. It's buried in the secondary annex of the original marriage agreement, not the standard prenuptial. There's a separate document. It was filed as an exhibit to the corporate trust, not as a standalone legal instrument. I'll be honest with you, Vit, I've reviewed it twice since last night, and it's extraordinarily well constructed. I've been practicing law for 38 years, and I have not seen anything quite like it. Vit's voice came out flat. What does it say? In essence, if the primary beneficiary of the trust, which is you, publicly repudiates the secondary beneficiary, which is Elara, in a manner witnessed by a quorum of organizational stakeholders, Control of the trust's administrative function transfers automatically to the secondary beneficiary. A long pause. The gala last night was witnessed by approximately 500 individuals, a significant number of whom are documented stakeholders in the Moretti corporate structure. The diner noise continued around them. Someone's coffee cup clattered against a saucer. A television above the counter was running a morning news segment, the anchor's voice a continuous low murmur. She built that into the marriage agreement, Vitt said. Into an annex that was filed as a corporate exhibit, yes. It would have required a very careful reading of the complete document package to locate it. It was, and I want to be precise here, not hidden in a way that was illegal. It was simply not prominently marked. 7 years, Vitt said. Yes. It's been there for 7 years. Since the day you signed the original agreement. Vitt ended the call, slid the phone back to Franco, sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table, looking at nothing. Franco waited. She planned this from the beginning, Vitt said. Not a question. It looks that way, sir. Or she planned for the possibility. He was quiet for another moment. Which is worse. Franco said nothing because there was nothing useful to say, and Franco was smart enough to know it. He found Carmine Asante at 11 that morning. Not at the Moretti offices on 46th, Carmine wasn't there, and neither were Rio or Stellan, and the woman at the front desk had the specifically careful expression of someone who has been told to say nothing useful. Vitt didn't push her. He drove to the restaurant Carmine used as a personal office, a small Italian place in Bensonhurst that opened for lunch and smelled permanently of garlic and cigarette smoke, where the back booth had been Carmine's unofficial workspace for 15 years. Carmine was in the booth, alone. He looked up when Vitt walked in, and whatever he saw in Vitt's face made him set down his espresso cup. Vitt slid into the seat across from him without being invited. You followed her out of the ballroom, Vitt said. Yes. You, Rio, and Stellan. Yes. After 19 years. Carmine looked at him steadily. He was 53, built like a man who had done physical work for decades and still carried the residue of it, with a face that was not unkind but had not been soft in a very long time. He and Vitt had known each other since Vitt was 22. They had been through things together that neither of them would ever describe to anyone outside the room. You want to know why, Carmine said. I think I deserve that. You want the honest answer or the careful one? Carmine. The older man exhaled slowly through his nose, picked up his espresso, didn't drink it. You know what Elara did when the Fenwick situation happened 3 years ago? Vitt knew. A financial dispute with a Connecticut operation that had nearly escalated into something much worse. A territorial confrontation that would have cost lives and drawn the kind of attention nobody wanted. She resolved it, Vitt said. She resolved it without you knowing there was a problem. You remember that trip to Chicago you took in October of that year? Vitt nodded. While you were in Chicago, she had 3 meetings, one with Fenwick's people, one with the bankers involved in the disputed account, and one with a federal contact who was apparently watching the whole situation and needed to understand that it was going to settle quietly. Carmine set the cup down. You came back from Chicago and everything was fine and you never knew there'd been a fire because she'd put it out before it reached you. Why didn't she tell me? Because she knew you. Carmine's voice was not cruel, but it was direct. She knew if you found out there was a confrontation brewing, you'd have handled it the way you handle everything, head-on, loud, and without thinking about what it cost afterward. And this one would have cost people. So she handled it her way, and the cost was nothing. Vitt was quiet. That's not the only time, Carmine said. There have been others. Some I know about, some I only suspect. The woman has been running interference on your worst impulses for 7 years, Vitt, running it quietly, so you never had to feel managed. He looked at him levelly. And last night you stood up in front of half the city and threw her out like she was furniture you were done with. I didn't know. No, you didn't know. That's the point. Carmine's voice dropped. She made sure you didn't know because she was protecting you. And you made sure you didn't know because knowing would have required paying attention. The words landed without drama. Carmine was not a man who raised his voice for effect, which made it worse. Vitt put his hands on the table. Where is she? I don't know. Carmine, I genuinely don't know. She left last night. I followed to make sure she got clear. After that, he shrugged. She doesn't need me to know where she is. That's not how she operates. Is she safe?
Something shifted in Carmine's expression. Not warmth exactly, but a recognition of something. That's the first question you've asked about her that isn't about what she took with her. Vit said nothing. I think she's safe, Carmine said. I think she's more than safe. I think she's exactly where she planned to be. He picked up his espresso again. The question you should be asking isn't where she is, Vit. The question is who knew this was coming besides her, because someone pointed you at that microphone last night, and it wasn't Elara. Vit went still. What do you mean? I mean that the idea for the announcement, the gala, the public statement, Sabrina standing there in front of everyone, that wasn't all yours, was it? Carmine looked at him. Think about the last 6 months. Think about who was in your ear. Vit thought about it. Dorian. Dorian in his study in February, leaning back in his chair, saying that the organization needed a visible statement of forward momentum. Saying that the old structures were becoming liabilities. Saying, carefully, over several conversations, never all at once, that Elara's role had become a kind of weight, that her quiet control of too many threads was a vulnerability, that a man in Vit's position needed someone beside him who represented the future rather than the architecture of the past. Vit had believed he was making his own decision. He was suddenly not sure he had made any part of it himself. Dorian, he said. Carmine didn't confirm or deny. He just looked at Vit with the expression of a man who has said what he came to say and is now waiting to see if the person across from him is smart enough to do something with it. Vit stood up. There's one more thing, Carmine said. Vit stopped. The reason I followed her out last night, it wasn't just about loyalty to Elara. There's something else in motion, something that started before the gala. Carmine's voice dropped lower. Someone has been feeding information to the Vasquez organization. Routes, schedules, warehouse locations, things that only 3 or 4 people in this operation would know. He paused. 2 of those shipments got hit in the last 8 weeks. You wrote it off as bad luck. It wasn't bad luck, Vit said. No. And Elara knew. I believe she's known longer than either of us. Carmine looked at him steadily. Which means she let it happen. Let whoever it is keep operating. Let them think they were invisible. He paused. Ask yourself why a woman as careful as Elara would do that. Vit knew the answer before Carmine finished the sentence. She was waiting for them to show themselves completely. He walked out of the restaurant into the midday noise of Bensonhurst, and the city moved around him the way it always did. Indifferent, relentless. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Vittorio Moretti felt the specific, unfamiliar weight of a man who has been several steps behind for a very long time, and is only now beginning to understand the shape of the board he has been playing on. His phone buzzed in his pocket. An unknown number. He answered it. Silence for a moment. Then Elara's voice, calm and clear, as if she were calling from an office on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. There's a warehouse on the waterfront, she said. Pier 61. Come alone. Come now. A pause. And Vit, don't tell Dorian. The call ended. He stood on the sidewalk with the phone in his hand, the midday sun flat and cold above the rooftops, and the entire city pressing around him like it had somewhere better to be. He had no leverage, no accounts, no access to half his facilities. 3 of his most experienced men were operating outside his orbit. His consigliere of 20 years had spent 6 months steering him toward a decision that had cost him his empire in a single evening. And the woman he had publicly humiliated in front of 500 people was the only one offering him a door. He walked to his car. He told Paolo to take him to Pier 61. He did not call Dorian. Pier 61 smelled like rust and river water and the particular cold that comes off the Hudson in late autumn. Not clean cold, not the kind that sharpens you, but the kind that settles into your joints and reminds you that the city has been here longer than you and will be here long after. Vit told Paolo to stay with the car. He walked the length of the pier alone, hands in his coat pockets, the wooden planks soft and slightly giving beneath his feet. The warehouse at the end was a long, low industrial structure. Corrugated metal walls, high windows that hadn't been cleaned in years, a loading door on the water side that hung slightly open. The kind of place that had been legitimately useful once and was now useful in different ways. He pushed through the side door. Inside, the light came from 4 portable work lamps positioned in the corners, the kind that construction crews use, throwing a flat white light that flattened everything and created no shadows worth hiding in. The space was mostly empty. Some pallets stacked against the far wall, a folding table in the center, 2 chairs. Elara was standing beside the table. She was not alone. Carmine was there, which didn't surprise him, because Carmine had told him nothing, and Carmine's loyalty had clearly already completed its pivot. Rio Santini stood near the loading door, arms crossed, watching Vit the way you watch something you're not sure is going to behave. And Stellan Park was at the far end of the room with a laptop open on one of the pallets, his back half turned, fingers moving. Elara was dressed simply. Dark slacks, a gray jacket, her hair pulled back. No jewelry. The absence of the wedding ring on her left hand was not dramatic. It was just a fact, a small negative space that Vit's eyes went to once and then away from. She looked at him when he came in, not with anger, not with triumph, with the specific expression of a person who has been waiting for something for a very long time and is now simply present for its arrival. "You came alone," she said. "You asked me to." "I asked you not to tell Dorian. That's different." "I didn't tell Dorian." She studied him for a moment, the way she always had, not searching exactly, more like confirming, like she already knew the answer and was simply verifying that the evidence matched. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She remained standing, which he understood was not accidental. Elara did not do things accidentally. "I'm going to tell you some things," she said. "You're going to want to interrupt. Don't." She paused. "Not because I don't want to hear what you think, because what I'm about to tell you is going to change what you think. And if you interrupt before I finish, you'll be reacting to a version of the truth that isn't complete." Vit put his hands flat on the table. "Talk, Mom." She had first noticed the pattern 8 months ago. Not a single moment of revelation, nothing that dramatic. A sequence of small data points that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. A route timing that was off by 40 minutes in a way that could only be explained by someone who knew the original schedule and had shared it. A warehouse contact in Newark who received a call from an unknown number 20 minutes before an inspection that shouldn't have been possible to predict. A financial transfer that moved through the correct channels in the correct sequence but arrived 12 hours late, which was the kind of delay that only happened when someone who understood the system was using it to create a window. She had pulled the thread. It had taken her 3 months of quiet work, the kind she was practiced at, the kind that looked like nothing from the outside, that looked like a woman managing household accounts and attending charity lunches and showing up at her husband's side for the various public functions that punctuated their life. While she was doing all of that, she was also building a map. The map led to the Vasquez organization. That part she'd confirmed by February. Someone inside the Moretti operation was feeding Vasquez information that was specific enough, precise enough, and consistently accurate enough that it could only be coming from someone with deep structural knowledge of the organization. The map also led somewhere she hadn't expected. She slid a folder across the table to Vit. He opened it. Financial records, transfer logs. A series of communications pulled from a server that he recognized. It was the same secure messaging platform the organization used for internal coordination, the kind of platform that was supposed to be impenetrable. "Page 4, Elara said. He turned to page 4. The communications were between 2 parties identified in the logs only by account codes. But at the bottom of the page was a decryption key that Stellan had apparently extracted because the account codes had been resolved into names. One of them was a name Vit didn't recognize. A contact inside the Vasquez operation, a mid-level coordinator named Brea. The other name was Dorian Kessler. Vit looked at the page for a long time without speaking. The warehouse was very quiet. The river moved against the pilings outside. Somewhere above them, a bird was walking on the metal roof, its feet making small, irregular sounds. "How long?" Vit said. His voice was steady. He was surprised by how steady it was. "The earliest communication I can confirm is 14 months ago, but the structural signs suggest it started before that." Elara's voice was the same, not soft, not cold, simply factual. "The 2 shipments that were hit in the last 8 weeks. He timed those to coincide with periods when you were traveling or distracted. Both of them happened during windows where his access to your schedule was complete. He's had access to my schedule for 20 years. "Yes." Vit closed the folder, put his hands back flat on the table, looked at the surface of it. Scarred, old wood, the kind that had absorbed a lot of use.
The gala, he said. Yes. He pushed me toward it. He built the entire architecture of the idea over 6 months and let you believe you arrived at it yourself. She paused. He needed you to publicly repudiate me. Not because of the succession clause. He didn't know about the succession clause. He needed me removed from the operational picture because he understood that as long as I was in the structure, any attempt to seize control of the financial architecture would fail. I was the one person who knew the system well enough to block him. Vit looked up at her. So he got me to remove you. And then planned to use the chaos of the aftermath, your locked accounts, the operational disruptions, the blow to your credibility in front of the entire underworld, to position himself as the stabilizing force. He would have come to you in the next week or two, offered solutions, offered contacts, offered to mediate with the banks, and restore access through arrangements that would have shifted effective control of the financial structure to him. She paused again. By the time you understood what had happened, there would have been nothing left to take back. The words went in clean and stayed there. Vit had known betrayal before. It was an occupational condition. The nature of the world he operated in meant that loyalty was always conditional on something, and the something changed. He had lost men before, had been sold out before, in small ways, in ways that cost him money or time or positioning. He had never been sold out by someone he trusted the way he trusted Dorian Kessler. Dorian, who had sat at his father's table, who had been the voice in the room Vit listened to when he was 22 and didn't know enough to know what he didn't know, who had been, and Vit could admit this to himself now, in this warehouse, with the river outside, the closest thing to a mentor he had ever had. He stood up, not with speed, slowly, the way a man stands when his legs are working correctly, but the rest of him is processing something that doesn't have a clean physical outlet. He walked to the far wall and stood there for a moment with his back to the room. Nobody spoke. They understood, all of them, that this was not a moment for commentary. He stood there for maybe 30 seconds. Then he turned around. "What do you need from me?" he said. Elara looked at him. Whatever she saw in his face made something shift in hers. Not softness, not victory, something more complicated than either. "Right now? Nothing from you." She moved to the folding table where Stellan had brought the laptop over. Stellan has been tracing the communication channel between Dorian and the Vasquez contact for the last 3 weeks. He's identified a pattern in the timing. They communicate within a specific 6-hour window every 4 days. The next window opens in 31 hours. You're going to intercept it. I already have the intercept in place. What I need is for Dorian to believe for the next 31 hours that everything is moving exactly the way he planned. She looked at Vit directly. Which means I need you to behave like a man who is losing. Vit was quiet for a moment. That shouldn't be difficult, he said. Since I am. No. Her voice was precise. You're not. But he needs to believe you are. He needs to believe you're scrambling, disoriented, that the gala fallout has fractured your operation and you're looking for any handhold you can find. A pause. He'll offer you one. When he does, you take it. You let him into whatever part of the structure he asks for access to. And then Stellan documents the access in real time. The communication window opens. Dorian signals the Vasquez operation that the transfer of effective control is proceeding, and we have everything on record. She closed the laptop. Every communication, every transfer authorization, every contact, admissible and complete. Vit looked at her. You've had this planned. I've had contingencies planned. For how long? She met his gaze and held it and didn't look away. Long enough? He asked the question that had been sitting at the base of everything since the night before. If you knew Dorian was moving against me, if you knew months ago, why didn't you tell me? The warehouse was quiet again. Elara put her hands in the pockets of her jacket. Because you would have confronted him, she said, directly, immediately, without complete evidence. And he would have denied it, and you would have had to choose between your word and his, and 20 years of trust would have weighed against 6 months of suspicion. You would have chosen wrong. She paused. Or you would have had him killed, which would have accomplished nothing except removing one visible target while every system he'd put in place continued operating. So you let it run. I let it run until it was finished, until I had everything, until there was no version of events where he could argue his way out or disappear quietly into a defense. Vit breathed out slowly through his nose. And the gala, you let that run too. The gala was the one thing I didn't fully anticipate, she said. And for the first time, something crossed her face that wasn't control. A small, compressed thing. Not grief, not exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that lived in the same building. I knew he would push you toward a public demonstration of some kind. I didn't know it would be that specific. She stopped. I didn't know you would be that willing. The silence that followed was a different kind than all the others. Vit looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything, and all the noise of the previous 7 years was in the room with them. All of it, the good parts and the wasted parts, and the parts where he had been careless with something that didn't deserve carelessness. He didn't apologize. Not because he didn't mean it, but because he understood that the moment for it wasn't now, and Elara was not a woman who received apologies she hadn't yet decided to do anything with. Tell me what I need to do, he said. Oh. He called Dorian at noon from his car, with Paolo driving and the city sliding past the windows in that flat late autumn light that makes New York look like a photograph of itself. He made himself sound tired. It wasn't hard. He was tired. I need to talk, he told Dorian. Come to the office at 2. Dorian agreed with the right amount of concern in his voice, the specific concern of a man who is performing worry he doesn't feel. Vit listened to it and recognized it now. Recognized the texture of it, the slight excess of solicitude, and said nothing. He sat in the office at 2 o'clock and let Dorian talk. Dorian was masterful. He came in carrying coffee, set one in front of Vit without being asked, sat in the chair across the desk the way he had sat in that chair for 20 years, and began to build his case with the patience and precision of a man who had been preparing it for months. The organization needed stability, Dorian said. The public fallout from the gala had created a perception problem. The locked accounts were a temporary issue. He had contacts who could facilitate a review process, people at the banking level who owed the Moretti name certain considerations. He had spoken, quietly, to 2 of the organization's major partners in the last 24 hours, and both had expressed a desire to maintain the relationship, but had raised concerns about the reliability of the current structure. What they need to see, Dorian said, is a clear line of authority, no ambiguity about who controls what. And you think you can provide that, Vit said. I think I can help you provide it. I've been in this world a long time, Vit. I know who needs to be called. I know what language to use. He paused. Let me make some calls on your behalf. Let me reach out to the banking contacts. Give me a temporary authorization on the accounts, just enough to initiate the review process and demonstrate good faith. And I can have this stabilized within a week. Vit looked at him. Dorian Kessler was 61 years old and had spent his entire adult life in rooms where power was traded and betrayal was a professional instrument, and he was very, very good at what he did. His face showed nothing except the reasonable concern of a longtime advisor managing a crisis. All right, Vit said, draw up the authorization. Something moved through Dorian's eyes, very fast, very controlled, gone almost before it arrived. Satisfaction. The deep, cellular satisfaction of a plan arriving at its destination. I'll have it ready this afternoon, Dorian said. He left the office 40 minutes later. Vit sat alone for a moment. Then he called Stellan. He took it, he said. I know, Stellan said. I'm already watching the access trail. Blah. The 31 hours were the longest of Vit's life. He went through them with the mechanical focus of a man operating on a plan that belongs to someone else, showing up where he was supposed to show up, saying what he was supposed to say, maintaining the performance of a man who was losing ground and grasping at whatever was offered. He met with 2 of the organization's partners and said the right things. He returned Dorian's calls promptly and agreed to everything Dorian suggested. He did not sleep. He sat in his apartment, not the penthouse. He'd moved to a secondary property. Sabrina was still at the penthouse, and he wasn't ready for that conversation yet. And he read through the folder Elara had given him until he knew every page of it without looking. 14 months of documented communication. 15 confirmed instances of compromised operational information. 2 men, low-level, neither of them aware of what they were carrying, who had been used as unwitting conduits between Dorian's network and the Vasquez contact.
He thought about Dorian sitting across from him in the brownstone that morning, coffee in hand, reading glasses on his head. The practiced ease of it. The way he had steered the conversation away from his own knowledge of the authorization structure, pivoting smoothly to a commentary on Vit's failings as if it were a tutorial rather than a deflection. 20 years. He thought about that. Not with sentiment. He had moved past sentiment in the warehouse with the river sounds and Elara's precise voice laying out the architecture of it, but with the kind of attention you give to something you need to fully understand before you act. 20 years of proximity, 20 years of access, 20 years of being the voice Vit listened to when he didn't listen to anyone else. He thought about what that meant, not just in terms of the current betrayal, but in terms of everything that had come before it. Every decision Dorian had shaped, every conversation Dorian had steered, every moment where Vit had believed he was making his own call because the manipulation was too clean to feel like anything other than his own thinking. He thought about Elara, about how she had sat 3 feet from Dorian at dozens of dinners and meetings over 7 years and had never trusted him. Had never said so. She wasn't someone who issued warnings without evidence, but had quietly, over years, built a financial architecture that put her name on the mechanisms that mattered precisely because she understood that the danger to Vit was never going to come from outside. She had spent 7 years protecting him from a man he would never have believed could hurt him, and he had spent 7 years not seeing it, and then stood up in a ballroom and handed Dorian exactly what he needed by discarding the one person who was in the way. He sat with that for a long time. The communication window opened at 6:14 in the evening on the second day. Stellan called him 11 minutes later. "It's done," Stellan said. "Full exchange." Dorian signaled the Vasquez contact that the administrative transfer was in process, that Moretti access to the primary accounts had been authorized under a third-party review structure with Dorian as the initiating agent. He attached a file. A pause. The file contains a complete map of the Moretti financial structure. Every account, every holding company, every trust, with access codes. Vit was quiet. "He was going to hand them everything," Stellan said. "I know." The Vasquez operation would have had full structural access within 48 hours. They wouldn't have needed to fight for it. They would have just walked in. "I know." Vit stood up from where he'd been sitting, moved to the window. The city below was in its early evening state, lights beginning to come on, the sky that specific dark blue that comes before full dark. "Does Elara have the file?" "Server trail is fully documented." A pause. "She also has something else. Something that came through in the secondary channel. A communication from before the 14-month window I was tracking, from about 3 years ago." Vit felt the specific cold that had been visiting him intermittently for 2 days. "What does it say?" Stellan was quiet for a moment. "It's about the Fenwick situation." Vit went very still. "The reason it almost became a confrontation," Stellan said carefully, "was because someone tipped Fenwick's people that the Moretti organization was planning to move against their Connecticut operation. Fenwick's people got aggressive because they thought they were about to be hit. They weren't, but someone told them they were." "Dorian," Vit said. "The communication is between Dorian and a Fenwick intermediary. It's 3 years old. He manufactured the confrontation." A pause. "Elara's meetings, the ones that resolved it. She was cleaning up a fire that Dorian had deliberately set." Vit pressed his hand flat against the cold window glass and looked at the city and thought about the specific architectural patience of a man who had spent years creating crises and then positioning himself as the solution, who had spent years finding the precise threads to pull to make everything around him slightly more unstable, slightly more dependent on his guidance, slightly more convinced that Vittorio Moretti could not function without Dorian Kessler's steady hand. And the only person who had seen it, who had understood what it was, who had been quietly absorbing the damage and repairing it without once making Vit feel managed or inadequate or anything other than exactly who he believed himself to be. That person was Elara, who he had replaced. In public, with 500 witnesses. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number, the same one Elara had used to call him from Pier 61. 2 words. They moved. He was already putting on his jacket when his front door came open without a knock. It was Rio Santini, breathing hard, eyes sharp with the specific alertness that Vit had learned over years, meant the situation had crossed from theoretical to physical. "We've got a problem," Rio said. "Vasquez people. They're not waiting for the administrative transfer." "Where?" "They hit the Greenpoint warehouse 20 minutes ago. 4 men, armed. They took out 2 of our guys. Not killed, but down." Rio stepped inside, closed the door behind him. "And there's a second team. Stellan just picked them up on the security feed." He paused. "They're heading for the penthouse." Vit thought of Sabrina, still at the penthouse. Sabrina, who had been placed there by a series of decisions that were not as accidental as he'd believed. "Get her out," he said immediately. "Already working on it. But Vit—" Rio stopped, looked at him with the expression of a man who has news he has been deciding how to deliver. "The second team isn't going for the penthouse because Sabrina's there. They don't care about Sabrina." He paused. "They have a location on you." "Who gave them the location?" Rio's jaw tightened. "The authorization document Dorian sent through the secure channel tonight. It had a data packet attached to the file. Stellan found it when he was logging everything. Embedded tracking. It went active when you opened the document this afternoon." Vit looked at him. "They know exactly where you are," Rio said. "They've known since 4:15 this afternoon." The window behind Vit exploded inward. Not a bullet, a concussion from something hitting the exterior wall 2 floors below. A physical shockwave that blew the glass in and dropped Vit to the floor on instinct, Rio going down beside him, both of them moving before the sound fully arrived. Cold air poured through the broken window. The city noise came in raw and immediate. Rio was already on his phone. "We're compromised. Pull everyone back to secondary." He looked at Vit on the floor beside him, glass in his hair, the wind cutting through the room. "We need to move, right now." Vit pushed himself up. His hands were bleeding from the glass. Small cuts, nothing serious, but the blood was bright and real and immediate, and it cut through everything theoretical about the last 48 hours and deposited him fully, physically, in the present moment. He had no accounts, no primary facilities, no consigliere, none he could trust. His operation was fractured, his location was burned, a Vasquez strike team was somewhere in the building below him, and the man who had spent 20 years as the architecture of his judgment had just tried to hand him and everything he'd built to the people most positioned to destroy it. Rio pulled him toward the back stairwell. They went down fast, 4 flights, the stairwell cold and echoey, and at the second-floor landing, Vit's phone rang. Elara. He answered it at a dead run. "I know," he said. "I know you know," she said. Her voice was the same, calm, present, factual. "There's a car on the service street behind the building. Gray sedan. Paulo is driving. Get to it." "How did you—" "I've been watching the building since this afternoon. I knew the tracking packet was active. I was hoping Dorian would wait until the communication window closed before he moved." A brief pause. "He didn't wait. Elara, get to the car, Vit." He got to the car. Paulo was there, engine running, the gray sedan unremarkable and exactly right. Rio got in beside Vit. Paulo pulled out before the door was fully closed and moved into traffic without speed, without drama, just a car joining the evening flow of the city. Vit sat in the back and pressed his bleeding hand against his leg and breathed. "Where are we going?" Paulo said. Vit's phone buzzed. A text from Elara, an address. He read it to Paulo. Paulo drove. And as the city moved around them in its ordinary and different way, Vit Moretti sat in the back of a gray sedan with glass cuts on his hands, and the complete dismantling of everything he had believed about his empire, his judgment, and his own life settled around him like debris. And he understood, fully, finally, without the comfortable distance of a man who has always had enough power to defer the moment of real reckoning, that the only way through what was coming was not going to look anything like the way he had moved through every difficult thing that had come before. There was no momentum available, no forward charge, no version of this where he could simply be Vittorio Moretti and let that be sufficient. The man who had survived this long by never looking back was going to have to stop. And the woman he had thrown away in public, in front of 500 witnesses, was the only reason he was still alive to do it. The address was a converted loft in Red Hook, 4 blocks from the water, on a street that had been industrial once and was now that specific in-between thing, not yet gentrified enough to have good lighting, not derelict enough to be invisible. Paulo parked on the cross street.
Vit got out and his legs were steady, but his hands were not, the cuts from the window glass still seeping, and he pressed his knuckles against his coat and walked to the building's side entrance, where Carmine was waiting with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who has stopped being surprised by anything. Carmine looked at his hands, said nothing, opened the door. Inside, the loft was large and mostly bare, a space that had been used for storage recently, the floor marked with the rectangular ghosts of shelving units that were no longer there. Portable lights, again. A folding table, longer this time, with 3 laptops open and Stellan moving between them with the focused economy of someone running out of time. Rio went straight to Stellan's side without being asked. 2 men Vit didn't recognize were positioned near the windows. Not Moretti soldiers, not anyone from his network, which meant they were Elara's, which meant Elara had a network he had never known about. He filed that away. Elara was at the table. She had changed clothes since Pier 61. Same practical severity, different jacket, her hair still back. She had a phone pressed to her ear and she was listening, not speaking, and her free hand was flat on the table and absolutely still. She ended the call when she saw him, looked at his hands. "Sit down," she said. "Marta." Marta materialized from a back corner of the loft with a first aid kit. Of course Marta was here. Vit sat down at the table and let Marta clean the cuts on his hands with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had dealt with worse. And he watched Elara move to Stellan's station and lean over the laptop, and he thought about how many rooms like this she had probably operated in while he was somewhere else believing he was the one running things. "The Vasquez team that hit Greenpoint," Elara said without turning around. "They pulled back 20 minutes ago. Both of ours who went down are stable. Carmine's people got to them." She turned. "The team at your building made entry. They're gone now. Nothing useful left there." "They were looking for documents," Vit said. "They were looking for the physical copies of the trust documents, the originals." She moved back to the main table. "Dorian told them where to look. He believed I kept the originals at your apartment. We had a conversation about document storage 2 years ago, and I told him that's where the primary safe was." A pause. "I moved everything 8 months ago." Vit stared at her. "When you first noticed the pattern?" "Yes." Marta finished with his hands. The cuts were small and clean, taped over efficiently. Vit flexed his fingers and looked at the tape and thought about the apartment. The safe behind the study wall, the one he'd watched Elara access 100 times, empty now for 8 months. And Dorian had sent men into it tonight believing it held the only physical documentation that could— "Wait," Vit said. "If the originals are gone and Dorian thinks the Vasquez people have them, then he'll move faster," Elara said. "He'll assume he has full control of the documentation now. He'll try to complete the administrative transfer before we can reconstruct anything." She looked at him directly. "Which means he's going to call you." Vit's phone rang. Everyone in the room went still. Not dramatically. The stilling of people who have been waiting for a specific thing and are now present for its arrival. Dorian Kessler. Vit looked at Elara. She nodded once. He answered. "Dorian." "Vit." The voice was smooth, controlled, the voice of a man who believes he is in complete command of a situation. "I heard about the incident at your apartment. Are you all right?" "I'm fine." Vit kept his voice flat and tired. "What the hell is happening?" "There are people who want to use this moment of instability to move against us. I've been working to contain it." A pause. The practiced pause of a man inserting just enough hesitation to seem genuine. "I need you to meet me, tonight. There are documents we need to execute to close the review process and stabilize the accounts before morning." "Where?" "The Moretti building on 46th, my office. 10 o'clock. Vit looked at Elara. She was already writing on a notepad, fast, and she slid it across the table. He read it. "Say yes. Don't come alone. We'll be ahead of you." 10 o'clock, Vit said. "I'll be there." He ended the call. The room exhaled. "He's not meeting you to execute documents," Elara said. She was already pulling on her jacket. "He's meeting you because he wants to know where you are. He needs to confirm your location before he moves the Vasquez people into position." She looked at Carmine. "How many can you get to 46th in 40 minutes?" 8, maybe 10. "I need 6 inside the building before Vit arrives. Service access." She looked at Stellan. "Pull the building's security feed. I need eyes on every floor." Stellan was already moving. "Elara." Vit stood up.
I'm not walking into that building as bait. No, she said. You're walking into it as yourself. There's a difference. She looked at him with the specific focus of someone who doesn't have time for the longer version of this. Dorian is not going to move on you inside the building. That's not what this meeting is. This meeting is him confirming you're isolated and manageable, and then he signals his people for the final move. We intercept the signal, we document the instruction, and then we have everything we need to hand to every law enforcement contact I have cultivated in the last 3 years. You have law enforcement contacts. Vit? Her voice was not impatient. It was the voice of someone stating something obvious without judgment. I have been managing the exposure risk of a criminal organization for 7 years. Of course, I have law enforcement contacts. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his coat. The Moretti building on 46th was 12 stories of mid-century office construction, the kind of building that had housed 3 different industries over 60 years, and now housed the legitimate face of the Moretti organization, a property management company on 4, a consulting firm on 7, the organizational offices on 10 that looked to anyone who looked like the orderly workspace of a successful family business. Vit arrived at 9:52. Paolo dropped him at the front entrance and moved the car around the block. Vit went through the lobby, which was empty at this hour except for a security guard at the desk, who had worked there for 6 years and whose name was Gerald, and who looked up when Vit came in with the neutral nod of a man who has learned not to ask questions. The elevator to 10. The hallway empty, lit by the overnight lighting, half strength, casting everything in a slightly amber wash that made the space feel preserved rather than inhabited. Dorian's office was at the end of the hall. The door was open, light inside. Vit walked to it and went in. Dorian was behind his desk. He was dressed as if it were a normal business meeting. Dark jacket, tie loosened slightly, the reading glasses on the desk beside an open folder. He stood when Vit came in and extended his hand, and Vit shook it because the performance had to be complete, and he felt the dry, firm pressure of Dorian's grip and kept his face at exactly the level of controlled exhaustion it needed to be. "Sit down," Dorian said. "You look like hell." "It's been a long 2 days." "It has, for both of us." Dorian moved around the desk. He didn't sit. He moved, a slow, deliberate circuit of the room that Vit recognized after a beat as a man putting distance between himself and a fixed point. Positioning. I want you to know that what I'm about to propose is in the best interest of the organization, not mine personally, the organization. Talk, Vit said. The accounts need to be consolidated under a single administrative identity. Right now, the dual authorization structure that Elara built into the system is creating a blockage that's going to become visible to people we don't want looking at it within 72 hours. Dorian set a document on the desk in front of Vit. This transfers the primary administrative function to a holding structure managed through my legal entity, temporarily, until the review is resolved. Vit looked at the document, didn't touch it. And Elara's authorization? This supersedes it. That's the point. Dorian's voice was careful, reasonable, the voice he had used for 20 years to make unreasonable things sound like the only sensible option. She built herself into the foundation of this thing. This removes her, permanently. If I sign this, Vit said slowly, you control the accounts. Administratively, on paper, until... Dorian. Vit looked up at him. Stop. The room went quiet. Dorian looked at him, and Vit watched something shift in the older man's face, a micro-adjustment, the first crack in a surface that had been perfectly maintained for 2 days. Something recalculating. The document Stellan pulled from your secure channel, Vit said. The one you sent at 6:14 this evening, with the structural map attached. He paused. And the tracking packet. Dorian's face completed its recalculation. What emerged on the other side of it was not what Vit had expected. Not panic. Not the scrambling of a man caught. Something slower and more considered. The expression of a man who has been playing a very long game and is now deciding whether to keep playing or to simply lay his cards on the table. He chose the table. How long have you known? Dorian said. Long enough. Elara. Yes. Dorian exhaled. Sat down in the chair across from the desk. Not his chair, the visitor's chair, as if some part of him understood that the spatial arrangement of the room had changed. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted. Not softer, but stripped of the professional warmth. What was underneath was something harder and more tired. The voice of the actual man. "She's extraordinary," he said. "I want you to know that I mean that genuinely. I have spent 20 years underestimating what she was building. I didn't fully understand it until about 18 months ago." He looked at Vit. "When I did understand it, I knew she was the only obstacle. Not you. You I could manage. You I have been managing." He said it without cruelty, as a fact. "Elara I could not manage, so I had to remove her." "By using me," Vit said. "By using your worst impulses." Dorian's voice was precise. "I didn't manufacture those. They were already there. I simply created the conditions where they expressed themselves at the right moment." The door to the office opened. Not from the hallway. From the interior door that connected to the adjacent conference room. A door that had been closed when Vit arrived, and that Dorian hadn't looked at once during the conversation, which Vit registered now as the tell it was. Two men came through, large, professionally composed, the specific physical type that exists in every criminal organization in every city, not for conversation. Vit stood up fast enough that the chair went back, but the hallway door opened at the same moment. Carmine came through first. Then two men Vit didn't know. Elara's people, he understood, the same ones from the loft. And behind them, Rio, who had a look on his face that was not aggression, but a kind of cold, absolute readiness. The two men from the conference room stopped. The room held. Dorian looked at Carmine, looked at the configuration, and something passed through his face. Not defeat, not yet, but the specific expression of a man whose calculation has just returned an unexpected result. "The building is covered," Carmine said. It was directed at the two men, not at Dorian. His voice was flat, matter of fact. "Ground floor, service entrance, roof access. You want to make a decision? Make it now." The two men looked at Dorian. Dorian looked at Vit. And then Dorian Kessler, who had been the most controlled person in every room he had entered for 40 years, did something Vit had never seen him do. He laughed. Not the laugh of a man who finds something funny. The laugh of a man releasing pressure. A short, genuine, slightly ragged sound that was more honest than anything else he'd said all night. "All right," he said quietly. He held up both hands, palms out. Looked at his two men. "Stand down." They stood down, stepped back. The room breathed again. Dorian looked at Vit. "You still need me," he said. "Not to run things. I understand that's finished, but the Vasquez organization, they have contacts, exposure to 3 of your operational channels, knowledge of your structure that came from me. If I disappear quietly, they move anyway. They don't need me to move. They just need the opportunity." He paused. "I can close that. I can make 2 calls and shut down their operational interest in the Moretti organization permanently. That's not leverage. I'm not negotiating. I'm telling you what's true." Vit looked at him for a long moment. "1 call," said a voice from the hallway door. Elara walked in. She had come up through the service stairwell. Vit understood that now, the secondary access that she would have mapped long before tonight. She moved to the center of the room, and she looked at Dorian with the expression of someone who has thought about this moment for a very long time and is now simply present for it, without heat, without triumph, without any of the emotional weight that the moment seemed to demand from the outside. "1 call to your Vasquez contact," she said. "Brea, you tell her the administrative transfer is canceled, the documentation package is compromised, and the Moretti organization is not in play." She paused. "I'll be listening. Stellan will be recording. If the language of the call matches the documented communication pattern we have, it confirms your cooperation on record." She tilted her head slightly. "If it doesn't match, if there's any signal embedded in the call that we haven't anticipated, the full documentation package goes to 3 federal contacts simultaneously. Tonight." Dorian looked at her, really looked at her. The way he probably should have looked at her years ago, before he'd made the mistake of believing that a quiet woman in a powerful man's shadow was a quiet woman. "The succession clause," he said. "You built that in from the beginning. From the day I signed the marriage agreement. Corrado knew? Corrado designed the concept. I designed the mechanism." She paused. "He trusted me to protect what he built. I did. Even from his own son. Especially from his own son." Her voice was not unkind. It was simply true. Vit is not his father's worst quality. He's his father's most unfinished one. Corrado knew that. It's why he asked me to stay. Dorian was quiet. He looked for the first time in Vit's memory like a man who was genuinely tired. Not tactical fatigue, the bone-level exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just been relieved of it involuntarily. "The call," he said. "Now," Elara said. Dorian made the call at 10:41. Stellan had the recording equipment running through a relay connected to Dorian's phone, patched in remotely, invisible to the call itself. Dorian sat at his desk and dialed the Vasquez contact number from memory. And Vit stood near the window and Elara stood near the door, and the room was absolutely still. Brea answered on the third ring. Dorian spoke 7 sentences. His voice was steady and professional and gave nothing away except exactly what it needed to give away. He told her the package was compromised, that the documentation had been accessed by a third party before delivery, that the administrative window was closed, that the Moretti organization's internal situation had stabilized, and the operational opportunity no longer existed. Brea was silent for a moment. Then she asked one question. "Kessler's orders?" she said. "Kessler's orders," Dorian said. The call ended. Stellan looked up from his laptop, gave Elara a nod. She looked at Carmine. "Take him downstairs. The federal contact will be here in 20 minutes. Carmine moved toward Dorian. Dorian stood without being asked. He straightened his jacket, put his reading glasses in his breast pocket with the precise, habitual movement of a man performing a small, ordinary action for possibly the last time. He looked at Vit. "For what it's worth," he said, "I did believe in the organization. Once." Vit said nothing. Dorian looked at Elara. "You would have made a better consigliere than I was." "I know," she said. Carmine walked him out. The federal contact was a woman named Reyes, compact, 50s, with the specific quality of a federal agent who has been doing this long enough to have stopped being impressed by the people she dealt with on either side of the law. She came with one other agent and a portable recording setup and the manner of someone executing a previously arranged process. She and Elara spoke privately for 4 minutes in the hallway. Vit watched through the glass panel beside the door. He couldn't hear the conversation. He didn't need to. He could read the body language. 2 people who had spoken before, who had an established understanding, who were confirming rather than negotiating. Elara had been working this for longer than 8 months, longer than a year, maybe longer than he could currently calculate. Rio appeared at his shoulder. "The Greenpoint situation is contained. Vasquez people pulled back within the last hour. Both our guys are at a private clinic, Carmine's doctor." "Good." "Sabrina?" Rio stopped. Vit looked at him. "She was picked up by Reyes's people about 30 minutes ago," Rio said carefully. "Apparently there's a separate file on her, federal level." He paused. "She had a prior relationship with the Vasquez organization before she came into our orbit, predating you by about 2 years. Vit absorbed this. "She wasn't working for Dorian," Rio said. "She was working for Vasquez, independently. Dorian used her because she was already in position." A pause. Neither of them knew the other was using her for the same purpose. "She was a tool," Vit said. "A willing one. But yes." He looked through the glass at Elara, still talking to Reyes. Elara knew about Sabrina. From what Stellan found, she identified Sabrina's Vasquez connection about 5 months ago. 5 months ago. Before the gala. Before Vit had stood up with a microphone and made Sabrina veil the public face of his future, Elara had known who Sabrina was and had still let the gala happen. Not because it didn't hurt. Vit understood that now with a clarity that was uncomfortable and necessary. She had let it happen because stopping it prematurely would have closed the trap before every player inside it had fully revealed themselves. She had absorbed the public humiliation of a packed ballroom, the stripping of her ring, the walkout of a room full of people who would gossip about it for years. She had absorbed all of it because the alternative was an incomplete capture. She had paid personally for a professional result. The hallway door opened. Elara came back in. She looked at Vit. "Reyes has the full package. The Dorian documentation, the Vasquez communication logs, the Sabrina file." She paused. "She's been building a parallel case for 18 months. What we provided tonight closes it. In exchange for what? Vit said. In exchange for the organization's financial records being available for a structured review, which I have been preparing for the last year. She met his gaze. There are elements of what we do that are going to have to change. Not everything, but the parts that carry the most exposure. A pause. I map them. I know what's cuttable without structural damage. I've been designing the transition. You've been designing the transition, he said slowly. While you were running the operation, yes. Someone had to. He looked at her for a long moment. The office around them was full of the quiet aftermath of something that had been building for a very long time. The specific stillness that follows the point where a thing stops being potential and becomes actual. Why? He said. After everything. After the gala. After what I... He stopped. Restarted. Why did you pull me out of that apartment? Why didn't you let them have me and take the empire outright? You had the mechanism. You had the succession clause. You had everything you needed to... Because it was never about the empire. Her voice was quiet and very clear. It was about what happens to the empire when it's run by someone who doesn't understand what it actually is. She paused. Your father asked me to stay because he was afraid of what you'd do to it alone. I stayed because I thought he was wrong. A pause. I was wrong too. You're not your father's worst fear, but you needed to be broken open first before you could be anything else. The lights in the office flickered. Outside, through the windows, the city moved in its perpetual motion. Sirens somewhere, the distant compression of traffic, the sky above the buildings, that particular New York dark that was never fully dark because the light always came back from somewhere. Vit's phone buzzed. He looked at it. An unknown number. Not Elara's secondary line, a different one. He answered it without knowing why. Static. Then a voice he didn't recognize, male, accented, the specific flat effect of someone reading from a script. Mr. Moretti, my employer would like you to know that the Kessler situation has been noted, and that the documentation currently in federal hands represents only a portion of the exposure we are aware of. A pause. My employer would like to meet. Vit looked at Elara. Who is your employer? He said. Someone who has been watching this situation for considerably longer than you realize. Another pause. Someone who was watching before Kessler, before the Vasquez approach. Someone who understood from the beginning that the Moretti organization's real vulnerability was never financial. The line was very clear, professional quality, not a burner phone. A secure line, routed carefully, the kind of technical overhead that required resources. Then what was the vulnerability? Vit said. The voice paused for exactly 3 seconds. The man at the top, it said, who trusted the wrong people and never looked at what was right in front of him. The call ended. Vit lowered the phone. His hands were steady now. The cuts on his knuckles ached with the specific grounding reality of physical damage, and his chest was tight with the compressed weight of everything the last 72 hours had deposited in him. And the office was quiet, and Elara was watching him with the expression of a woman who has just heard something she was not expecting. You heard that, he said. Stellan had it patched, she said. Her voice, for the first time all night, had something under the surface. Not fear. Elara didn't do fear the way most people did, but something alert and recalibrating, the sound of a very precise mind encountering a variable it hadn't fully accounted for. There's someone else, she said. There's someone else, Vit confirmed. He looked at her. And in the flat office light, in the aftermath of the longest 2 days of his life, with the cuts on his hands and the city outside and everything that had been broken and everything that was still standing, he understood with complete clarity that the man who had walked into this building an hour ago, the man who had operated on momentum and certainty and the comfortable assumption that he understood the shape of his world, that man was finished. What came next was going to require something different entirely. What came next was going to require him to do the one thing he had spent his entire life avoiding. He was going to have to ask someone else to lead. He looked at Elara. She was already thinking. Elara was already thinking, and Vit had learned, finally, at significant cost, to let her. She stood in the middle of Dorian's former office for maybe 90 seconds without speaking, which was a long time for the kind of silence she created. Not empty silence, but the kind that has mass, the kind that lets you know a mind is moving through something at speed.
Stellan was at the laptop. Rio was near the door. Carmine had not yet come back up from the lobby. Then she said, "Pull the call metadata." Stellan pulled it. "Routed through 4 relays," he said. 2 domestic, 2 offshore. The last offshore node is—" He stopped, looked up. "It's a server registered to a holding company in Luxembourg." Elara looked at him. "Which holding company?" Stellan read the registration name. The room went quiet in a different way than it had gone quiet before. Vit didn't recognize the name.
But he read Elara's face, the specific compressed stillness of someone who has just encountered a data point that reorders a significant portion of what they believed they understood. And he said, "You know it." "I know the structure it's registered under," she said carefully. "It's a shell, 3rd generation, which means it takes time to trace. But the parent company—" She stopped, made a decision. 3 years ago, when I was finalizing the trust restructuring after the Fenwick situation, I found an anomaly. A passive monitoring interest in one of the outer layer holding companies, something that predated my restructuring by at least 5 years. Someone was already watching, Vit said. Someone was already positioned, not actively, not moving against the organization, just watching, like an investor who bought a stake and was waiting to see how the asset developed. She paused. I couldn't identify the beneficial owner. The layers were too deep and I had other priorities. I noted it. I moved on. And now? And now someone using that same structure just called you to tell you they've been watching since before Dorian, since before any of this. She looked at him. That's not a threat. That's an introduction. An introduction to what? To a conversation they've decided it's time to have. The meeting was arranged in 36 hours. Not by Vit. He understood, without being told, that his role in the arrangement was to exist, to be the name that opened the door, while Elara built the architecture of the approach. She spent those 36 hours doing things he was not fully briefed on, making calls he was not present for. And he let her, because the man who would have insisted on being in every room for every conversation was the man who had just spent 4 days discovering exactly how much damage that quality had done. He used the 36 hours differently. He went to the private clinic where his 2 men, the ones who'd been taken down in the Greenpoint hit, were recovering. He sat with each of them for a while. Not for long. He was not built for extended bedside conversations, and they both knew it, and the visits would have been uncomfortable for everyone if he'd tried to make them into something they weren't. But he went. He sat. He said he was glad they were alive, and he meant it, and they knew he meant it, and that was enough. He went to the apartment in Red Hook where Marta had organized a temporary base of operations. Marta, who was apparently capable of converting any space into a functioning household within 4 hours, a quality Vit had benefited from for 11 years without once specifically noting it. And he ate a meal that he didn't taste and sat at the kitchen table with the file Elara had given him at Pier 61 and read every page of it again. He was reading it differently the second time. The first time he had been reading it as evidence of betrayal, Dorian's specifically. This time he was reading it as a map of every decision point over 14 months where someone could have intervened, where a different choice by a different version of himself might have changed the trajectory. There were more of them than he wanted to count. Small moments where he had chosen not to look carefully, not to ask the next question, not to sit with a piece of information long enough to understand what it actually meant. He was not given to self-examination. It was not a quality he had ever valued or cultivated. He had always found it slow and self-indulgent, the kind of thing men did when they had run out of forward motion. He sat with it anyway. He sat with the specific, grinding discomfort of a man who is not used to being wrong, discovering that he has been wrong in ways that compounded over years. And he did not try to argue himself out of it, or reframe it, or find the counter-argument that let him feel better. He just sat with it the way you sit with something that hurts when you finally accepted that the hurt is the point. Elara found him there at 2 a.m. She sat down across from him without preamble, the way she always had. No performance, no setup. Just present, which was, he understood now, one of her defining qualities, and the one he had most consistently failed to appreciate. "The meeting is set," she said. "Tomorrow night. Neutral location. They chose it." "Who are they?" She told him the name. He knew it. Not personally. The name belonged to a world that operated several strata above the level the Moretti organization had ever functioned at, the kind of name that appeared in connection with legitimate international finance, and also, if you knew where to look, in the margins of half a dozen arrangements that were considerably less legitimate, the kind of name that meant old money, in the specific sense of money that had been old long before it became necessary to be discreet about its origins. They've been holding a passive interest in the outer structure for 7 years, Elara said. They watched Corrado build the organization. They watched me restructure it. They watched you run it. She paused. They were not involved with Dorian's play. They had no interest in the Vasquez acquisition. Too noisy, too exposed. What they have interest in is the financial architecture I built. Specifically, the legitimate holding layer. They want to buy in, Vitt said. They want to formalize what was already an informal observation relationship. A partnership structured through the legitimate entities, which means the organization gets a layer of protection that nothing Dorian or Vasquez had access to could touch. She looked at him steadily. It also means accountability. To people who are not going to tolerate the kind of exposure that the last year has generated. They want the operation cleaned up. They want the operation survivable, she paused, which is the same thing I've been trying to build for 7 years. He looked at her. You've been in contact with them. For 6 months. She said it without apology. I initiated contact when I understood the full scope of Dorian's play. I needed to know whether his Vasquez arrangement had their backing. It didn't. A pause. Once I confirmed that, I began a parallel conversation about what the restructured organization might look like from their perspective. Without telling me. Without telling you. She held his gaze. Because telling you would have required you to make a decision about it before you had the information you needed to make it correctly. You would have gone to Dorian for counsel, and Dorian would have directed you away from it. She paused. I was protecting the option. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you protect a lot of things by not telling me about them. Yes. That has to change. She looked at him. Something moved through her expression. Not surprise, but a careful attention. The expression of someone receiving information they have been waiting a long time to hear and are not yet entirely certain is real. Yes, she said. It does. The meeting took place in a private room on the 43rd floor of a building in Midtown that did not have the Moretti name anywhere in its ownership structure, which was entirely the point. The man they met was in his late 60s, silver-haired, precisely dressed, with the hands of someone who had spent decades at desks, and the eyes of someone who had spent those same decades making sure the things that happened at those desks were never fully visible. He introduced himself with a first name only, Martin, and did not offer to explain whether this was a courtesy or a precaution. He looked at Elara when she walked in. Not at Vitt, at Elara. You built something remarkable, he said, with substandard raw material and significant interference. Elara sat down. The raw material wasn't substandard, she said. It was unfinished. Martin looked at Vitt. Vitt sat across from him and met the look directly, which was apparently the correct response, because something in Martin's face settled slightly. They talked for 2 hours. Vitt said less than he would have said in any meeting of comparable importance in the previous 10 years of his life, and what he said was precise, and he let Elara carry the structural weight of the conversation, and he watched Martin watch her, and he understood over the course of those 2 hours that this was what she had been building toward. Not just the protection of the organization, not just the neutralization of Dorian and the Vasquez interest, but this, a legitimate architecture around the remaining operation that made it something different than what it had been, something that could last. At the end of the 2 hours, Martin looked at both of them. The partnership will be structured through the outer holding layer. Ms. Voss Moretti retains administrative authority over the financial architecture. Mr. Moretti retains operational oversight of the physical assets and personnel. He paused. The arrangement is conditional on the completion of the structural review with the federal contact. Already in process, Elara said. I know. He looked at her with something that was not quite a smile, but was in that neighborhood. I've been watching your file for 3 years, Ms. Voss Moretti. I was beginning to wonder when you'd decide to introduce yourself. She looked at him calmly. I was waiting until I had something worth introducing. Sabrina Vale's federal processing took 4 days. Vit learned the outline of it from Reyes, who had no obligation to brief him and did so anyway as a professional courtesy to Elara. Sabrina had entered into a cooperation agreement. Her prior relationship with the Vasquez organization was the primary charge. The gala, in federal terms, was a footnote. She was not a violent actor, and she was not the architect of anything. She had been used by two separate parties simultaneously and had used them back in the ways available to her, and the result was a woman who had made a series of decisions from a position of limited options and was now in the process of accounting for them. Vit thought about that more than he expected to. Not with guilt. His guilt about Sabrina had a specific texture and a specific limit, and he was honest with himself about where it came from. He had used her too. Not the same way, not with the same knowledge, but the fundamental structure of the thing was the same. She had been convenient. He had not looked carefully at what she was. He had that in common with her, which was an uncomfortable thing to sit with. He did not visit her. That would have been the wrong thing for the wrong reasons, and he knew it. He simply let the thought of her be what it was, uncomfortable, unresolved, a small permanent accounting entry on the ledger of things he'd gotten wrong. Dorian Kessler's processing was more complex and took considerably longer. He cooperated fully, which Elara had anticipated. Dorian was many things, but he was not a man who would choose martyrdom over negotiation when negotiation remained available. He had, it emerged, been operating a parallel arrangement with the Vasquez organization for 22 months, not 14, as the initial documentation suggested. The earlier 8 months had been managed through a buffer that Stellan eventually traced, which added 3 additional charges to the federal file and removed whatever residual sympathy the cooperation agreement might have generated. Vit heard this from Elara on a Tuesday morning. They were in the kitchen of the Red Hook apartment, which had become, by default, the operational center of what remained. She told him with the same factual precision she brought to everything, and he listened, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, 22 months. Yes. He was running it when my father was still alive. A pause. The earliest confirmed communication predates Corrado's death by 4 months. Vit looked at his coffee. Corrado was sick by then, distracted. Yes. Dorian used that window. That's what the evidence suggests. He sat with that. It was a different kind of weight than everything else. The specific grief of a betrayal that reached back past the living into the territory of the dead, where it couldn't be answered or addressed or even properly witnessed. Vittorio Moretti had died believing Dorian Kessler was the man he'd trusted him to be. That was true and finished and could not be changed. Vit drank his coffee and did not say anything else about it. Some things did not require words. They required the specific, quiet dignity of being acknowledged and then carried. The structural review with Ria's office was completed in 3 weeks. It was not pleasant. There were elements of the Moretti organization's financial history that generated difficult conversations, that required Elara to sit in rooms with federal attorneys for hours at a time, with documentation she had prepared over the preceding 18 months, and walk through every line of it with the patience and precision of someone who had designed the system being reviewed and knew exactly where every body was buried, metaphorically, and in 1 or 2 cases, rather less metaphorically. She did not flinch. Vit watched her in those meetings when he was present. He was not always present, and when he was, he understood that his role was to exist as the named principal while she handled the substance. And he watched her absorb questions that were designed to destabilize and answer them with a completeness that left no room for follow-up. And he thought about the version of himself that had stood up in a ballroom and replaced her, and the distance between that version and the man sitting in this chair watching her work was significant enough that he could not fully connect them. At the end of the 3rd week, Reyes closed the review file. She shook Elara's hand, looked at Vit. "You have a very capable partner," she said. "I know," he said. "You knew late," she said. It was not unkind. It was simply factual, the way Elara was factual, and Vit recognized the quality and understood that the 2 women had spent enough time in the same rooms over the past month to have influenced each other's speech patterns slightly. "Yes," he said. "I did." The evening after the review closed, Elara went to her sister's house in Brooklyn. Her sister's name was Dana, younger by 4 years, a landscape architect, entirely outside the world. Elara had spent 7 years inside. Vit knew this because he had known Dana peripherally throughout the marriage, had attended 2 dinners at her house, had always found her pleasant and slightly guarded around him in the specific way of a person who loves someone and disapproves of their choices. He knew Elara went there because Marta told him, and he knew Marta told him because Marta had also made a series of loyalty decisions over the past month and had landed clearly and permanently on Elara's side of the line, which he did not hold against her because it was the correct decision. He did not follow. He did not call. He let her go to her sister and be whatever she was outside of all of it. Whatever the version of herself was that had existed before the organization, before Corrado, before the marriage and the 7 years and the accumulating weight of all the things she had absorbed in order to keep something intact. He had never thought about that version of her. He was thinking about it now. He spent the evening alone in the Red Hook apartment with a glass of bourbon he didn't finish, and he thought about what Carmine had said in the Bensonhurst restaurant, about Elara running interference on his worst impulses, making sure he never had to feel managed, about the specific invisible labor of a person who protects someone from the consequences of who they are, quietly, over years, without credit. He thought about what that cost, not strategically, personally, what it costs a person to be that careful, that consistently, for that long, around someone who doesn't notice they're doing it. He did not have a clean answer, but he sat with the question, which was more than he had done before. 3 days later, he asked to meet her. Not at the office. That was finished as a neutral space. Too much had happened in it. Not at the apartment. That belonged to the old arrangement, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. He suggested the restaurant where they had gone on their second date, 17 years ago. A small place in the West Village with no connection to the organization and no particular significance except that it was the first place he had taken her where he had actually been nervous, which was something he had never told her. She agreed, which was not the same as forgiving him. He understood that. They sat at a corner table, ordered food neither of them ate very much of. The restaurant had changed its menu twice since they'd been there in their mid-20s, and the walls were a different color, and the lighting was slightly different, and yet it was recognizably the same place, which was either a comfort or a provocation depending on how you looked at it. Elara looked at him across the table with the expression he had come to understand was her default state, present, attentive, giving nothing away that hadn't been considered first. "The partnership with Martin formalizes next week," she said. "I know. The outer holding layer restructuring is complete. The federal file is closed." She paused. "The organization is stable. More stable than it's been in years, probably." "More stable than I made it," he said. She didn't correct him. That was its own kind of answer. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to answer it honestly, not the way you answer things when you're protecting someone." She looked at him. "All right. When you built the succession clause into the marriage agreement, on the day we signed, did you believe you were ever going to use it?" She was quiet for a moment, long enough that he understood she was actually considering it, not preparing a performance of consideration. "I didn't know," she said finally. "I built it because the risk existed, and I don't design systems that ignore existing risks. But whether I believed—" She stopped, started again, more carefully. "I hoped I wouldn't need it. That's not the same as believing." She looked at him. "I wanted to be wrong about you." He felt that go in clean. "Were you?" he said. "Wrong." She looked at him across the restaurant table in the slightly different lighting of a place that had changed around its own bones. And she took her time, because she was a woman who did not issue verdicts she hadn't fully considered. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me in a year." It was not forgiveness. It was not a restoration. It was something more honest than either. A door left fractionally open by a person who had every reason to close it and was choosing, for reasons of her own that she was not required to explain, not to. He nodded. "There's something I should have said at Pier 61, he said. "Or before that. Or—" He stopped. "There are a lot of points where I should have said it. Vit, let me." He put his hands flat on the table. The tape was off now, the cuts healed to thin pink lines. "I spent 7 years in the same space as you, and I treated the work you did as infrastructure, like plumbing, something that functions or doesn't, and either way you don't think about it. I didn't see it as—" He stopped again. "I was not a man for whom this kind of sentence came easily, and he was not going to perform ease he didn't have. I didn't see it as yours, as something you chose and built and paid for every day." He looked at her. I'm sorry. Elara looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up her water glass. Drank. Set it down. I know, she said. Not I accept, or it's okay, or any of the formulations that would have made it easier on him. Just, I know. The specific response of a woman who has decided the acknowledgement is real and is recording it as data without yet deciding what to do with it. It was, he thought, the most Elara thing she had ever said to him. The Carrington Hotel ballroom. 6 weeks after the anniversary gala, on a Thursday evening in late November. The room was half what it had been that night. No 500-person gathering, no orchestra, no white tablecloths laid for a performance. A private dinner, 30 people. The organization's inner circle, the real one, not the curated public version, along with Martin's representatives and Reyes, who had accepted the invitation with the specific neutrality of a federal agent who attends things like this because the intelligence value outweighs the awkwardness. Elara had organized it. Of course she had. She stood at the head of the table when the room settled. She was wearing the same kind of thing she always wore. Dark, precise, nothing that asked for attention. She had not worn jewelry since the gala. She would, Vit suspected, decide when she was ready and not before. She spoke for about 4 minutes. Not a speech. She did not do speeches. A briefing. The structure of the new arrangement, the status of the federal review, the outline of the operational changes that were already in process. She used numbers when she had them and was specific about what was still being finalized, and she did not perform confidence she had, and she did not perform confidence she didn't. When she finished, nobody spoke for a moment. Then Carmine, from the middle of the table, started a slow clap. Not sarcastic, not theatrical. The genuine, specific applause of a man who has been in this world long enough to recognize something real when it's in front of him and has decided that recognizing it openly is worth more than playing it cool. The room followed. Elara looked at the table. Something moved through her face, not the contained control of the last 6 weeks, something under it, something that was less composed and more true. She looked at the applause the way a person looks at something they have waited a long time for and are not quite sure how to hold. She held it. Vit, from his seat 3 places down on her right, watched her face in that moment. He had looked at her face for 7 years and seen what he expected to see. The capable, composed woman who managed his world. He had not, in 7 years, looked carefully enough to see what was underneath it, what it had cost to maintain. He was looking now. She turned her head and found his eyes across the table. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed his old signet ring on the table in front of him. The Moretti ring, the one his father had given him, heavy gold with the family crest, the ring he had worn for 10 years as the symbol of what he ran and what he owned. He pushed it toward her. Not far. Just far enough that it moved from his space to the middle of the table, the neutral territory between them. She looked at it, then at him. He said quietly enough that only she could hear, "I thought I owned everything." She looked at him. "You did," she said. She didn't pick up the ring. She left it in the middle of the table, in the neutral space, and that was exactly right. Not something either of them held, but something that sat between them as evidence of a completed transaction whose final terms had not yet been fully negotiated. "Until you replaced me," she said. And for the first time since the night in the ballroom when everything had broken open, the corners of her mouth moved. Not a performance. Not a managed expression, a small, involuntary thing that arrived on its own terms without asking permission. Vit looked at it. Then he looked at the ring between them on the table. Then he looked at her. The room continued its dinner around them. Carmine was talking to Rio about something operational. Martin's representative was making notes. Marta was refilling water glasses with the contained efficiency of a woman who sees everything and says nothing. The city moved outside the windows in its perpetual, indifferent motion. And in the Carrington ballroom, at the table where 6 weeks earlier a man had stood up with a microphone and decided he knew what power looked like, 2 people sat in the particular silence of something that had been broken down to its foundation and was only now, carefully and without guarantees, beginning to ask itself what it wanted to become. Not a restoration, not a return to what it was before. Something that had been tested down to its bones and had found, in the process, that the bones were real. That was enough to start with. That was, for now, enough. Months passed the way months do after something large has changed. Not cleanly, not all at once, but in the accumulation of ordinary days that slowly stop feeling like aftermath and start feeling like life. The organization was smaller now. That was the first and most permanent change. Elara had cut 12 operational threads in the restructuring. Not dramatically, not with announcement, simply with the methodical precision of a person who knows which wires carry current and which ones are just noise. What remained was leaner and considerably less visible. And visibility, she had decided, was the enemy of longevity. Vit did not fight the cuts. He had earned the right to an opinion, and he used it selectively, on the things that mattered, and he let the rest go. It was the hardest thing he had ever learned to do. Martin's partnership formalized in December. The outer holding layer absorbed quietly into a structure that was, on paper, entirely legitimate, and what sat beneath that paper was nobody's business, except the people in the room who had signed it and understood what it meant. Reyes closed her file. The Vasquez organization, deprived of its intelligence advantage and its financial entry point, turned its attention elsewhere. Dorian Kessler entered a federal facility in February. Vit did not attend any of the proceedings. There was nothing he wanted to say that hadn't already been said by the documentation, and he was done performing emotions he didn't have for audiences that didn't need them. He visited his father's grave on a cold Saturday in January. Stood there for a while without speaking. He had never been a man for graveside conversation, but he stood long enough that it meant something, and he thought about what Corrado had understood about his son and what he'd trusted Elara to manage. And he thought about the specific courage of a dying man who asks someone to protect the people he loves from themselves. He did not think Corrado had been wrong. Elara moved back into the penthouse in March, not as a declaration, not as a restoration of anything that had existed before. As a practical decision by a woman who makes practical decisions, the penthouse was hers under the restructured trust, her office was nearby, and she was tired of the Red Hook apartment's plumbing. She told him this with the directness he had come to understand was her version of intimacy. No ceremony, no sentiment, just the truth stated plainly and allowed to be what it was. He helped her move 3 boxes. On a Tuesday evening in April, they had dinner at the kitchen table. Not at a restaurant, not at an event. At home, at the kitchen table, with food Marta had left in containers and the city outside the window doing what it always did. Vit looked at her across the table. She looked back. 7 years of marriage. 4 days that had dismantled it down to the ground. Months of rebuilding something they hadn't yet named because naming it would have required certainty neither of them was ready to claim. "Ask me now," he said, "whether you were wrong about me." She looked at him for a long moment. "Not yet," she said. She picked up her fork. He picked up his. Outside, the city moved. Inside, 2 people ate dinner in the particular quiet of something that had survived being broken, which is not the same as something that was never broken, but is, in its own way, stronger for knowing the difference.